Every executive has dashboards. Almost none have answers. When a hard question surfaces at 4 p.m. on Thursday, most leaders still call someone to pull a number, despite a $1 million tech stack. Michael built Wombat because the gap between data access and actual insight is real and still unsolved. Welcome to Some Goodness, where we engage seasoned business leaders and experts to share practical guidance and tips to help new and future C-level leaders maximize their impact. My guest today is Michael Stahl, CEO and founder of Wombat Data. Michael has led commercial operations, served as chief integration officer at a legal services roll-up, and co-founded a healthcare company. Today, we're talking about the gap between data and wisdom and why so few organizations have cracked it. Well, Michael, welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. Excited to be on the podcast and to talk about this with you, Richard.
Absolutely. Well, let's dive right in. I know you've been a leader at multiple companies across industries, legal, engineering, healthcare. We're talking about data today. And I'd just like to start at a high level. When did you first notice that data problems still, in light of all the technological advances, still isn't being solved? And kind of what is your perspective on that?
Yeah, I think I run into it every day. And as I started to move into the C-suite and participate in board meetings and higher level discussions, and was responsible for finding the answers to some of those questions rather than being given a plan to execute on, I started to notice just how hard it was, one, to really be focused on asking really good questions that drove better performance. But then also, once we had asked that and we felt like we had a good sense of what we needed to find, it was actually really hard to find. And even if we found the data, try to get it to the right place and analyze it well proved to be really difficult. And I think that's one of the things that stood out to me is that this was really a persistent and recurring problem across verticals. It wasn't just the legal industry. It wasn't just the engineering industry. It wasn't just healthcare. It was everywhere. And I just saw it as everybody was struggling with fragmentation of data and enterprise applications and systems that were siloed.
It's kind of surprising on the one hand, because certainly repositories of data are everywhere, right? They live in underlying systems and ERP systems and data lakes, if you want to call them that. And then on top of that, there's been lots of advances with BI tools, right? Are you finding it is it surprising leaders and board members that, getting the right answers from the data is still hard even today?
A little bit, I think it is, but I also think it's kind of how we've grown up. It's always been tough to get out of an application system. So whether you're in a CRM or an ERP, a lot of times that's where the data have been housed and that's where the analytical tools are. Or maybe you were able to put it somewhere else in a shared file and in a data lake, but usually that took an internal team that had technical expertise about where to migrate it, how to connect it to those applications, but you're still really kind of siloed and trapped by the tools within that application. And what I started to find, even as I went to bigger companies with a lot of resources and the ability to build internal data teams and technology teams, we still had trouble accessing external data sources that were really valuable to help us answer questions. So it wasn't just good enough to make sure our CRM and our ERP and our HRIS system connected. It was what does CMS data actually tell us about our patient population? Or what do demographic data and geospatial data tell us about how our patients move through space and time to go to a clinic or maybe miss an appointment? And all of that has a real impact on day-to-day operations and also revenue. And so even if people were solving the internal problems, and that was a big hill to climb and usually required a lot of money, we still weren't able to effectively solve accessing and integrating external data sources either. And I think it's just how a lot of data have either been trapped in systems that companies want to create a moat around and monetize everything, or just the challenge of layering those different data sources, internal and external. So yes, a little bit surprising, but it's in many ways, I think, something that has been a struggle for many people, including my entire professional career. And it's really just now that we've started to find some technology that starts to open up possibilities. And that's actually really the genesis behind my new chapter in life with Wombat.
That's awesome. I'd love to dig into that here in a minute, but just kind of talking about this reminds me of my old value engineering days and many, many years ago in supply chain management, where you have these different data silos in your ERP system, your SCM system, your MES system. We were finding that the same pencil was called five different things, right? And so there was a data translation problem that needed to be solved even back then. And so I resonate with kind of, this geeking out on data for sure. But
Yeah.
I did want to ask you, you've written about something called the streetlight effect. And so tell me, I thought that was kind of a unique perspective and way to think about things. So tell us about the streetlight effect.
Yeah, I think so. Part of this is the benefit of working with some fantastic data scientists at Barge as well, and developers, and we had similar experiences coming through different lenses. And really, it's this phenomenon and a cognitive bias where, and the parable is, if somebody loses their keys, they actually look where the street light shines because that's where the light is. But even if their keys may not be there, they look where they have the most ready access and visibility, even if that's not necessarily the best place to find good answers or good information. And so, what we experienced, how that translates into our professional day to day, is that where people have ready access to data is where they apply those business intelligence tools, is where they apply analysis, because that's where it's most easily, their information is most easily obtained. Even if they're external data sources, there may be unknown sources that people can go search for that actually will provide really insightful information and answer the questions more effectively that have a bigger impact on the business. It's tough for people to turn the lights on and go look other places, either because it's hard to know what you don't know, but a lot of times it's also, even when they do, they wish they had that CMS data, or they wish they had that demographic data or drive time data. They don't really know how to get it. And so it's back to, what can I do with what is most readily available to me and I can easily access? And that's how they try to solve problems, rather than continuing to push and dig at what's possible and what may be in the dark, and looking for flashlights or the floodlights.
I like that. I like that. So a little bit of cognitive bias there, really impacting the way we try to get insights or answer questions. You have lots of great stories to tell. Is there any just example from either the legal or the healthcare or some of your professions that, kind of illustrate that problem and how it can be a big issue for businesses?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the problems that illustrates this pretty effectively is that we were trying to understand no-show rates in our healthcare company, and why were certain patients not showing up, and were there patterns, and how could we address this more effectively? And we were really looking at what we had readily available to us, which was our EHR data, and then using that with modeling tools that we had that were more readily available. And honestly, it wasn't until I was introduced to geospatial information systems and the possibility that I could layer other information and take where patients were in a zip code level, their no-show rates, but then start to take external information and run analysis and regression modeling to predict, were there factors that otherwise weren't available to me in my internal systems that drove this outcome? And it was really fascinating to see and to understand that things like drive time, which once I saw it, it was like, of course, you turn the lights on, of course, that's where your keys were. You walk through that area. But until you shine the lights on that, it was hard for me to see it. But the ability to layer drive time data that's actually different than mileage. We all live in cities, and just because you live 2 miles from someplace doesn't mean it's actually quick to get to. And it was really important and insightful for me to understand that these types of factors, one, were possible to integrate into and layer into analysis, and two, really drove me to ask deeper questions and continue to push at the variables and the levers that were going to have the biggest impact on my business, rather than just settling for what I had in my internal enterprise applications.
Right. That's great. That helps, just kind of bring some clarity around connecting the dots between the streetlight effect and how we can maybe expose some of those risks or tendencies or biases in different businesses.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk a little bit about, okay, so how do we solve some of this, and why hasn't throwing a BI tool on top of your data lake solved it? And then where does AI fit in all of this? That's a lot we could get into, but let's start moving to, what is the answer, and how do companies get it wrong, and how do they need to start thinking to get it right?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple different ways that are pretty common, and I think at this point, even if you're not a technologist, people are familiar with terms and like APIs, application programming interfaces, and ways in which systems talk to each other. Not every system actually has open APIs that allow developers to connect those systems. There are some applications that keep them closed and try to monetize the data, which makes it hard for businesses to get the data out of. Even if you do, then you also have to find data sources. And this is back to the streetlight effect. I had to go for external data sources, and sometimes they're just downloadable from the web. CMS is a great example. That data is you can download, but it's actually hard to organize, store, clean, keep refreshed. And so even when teams can connect data sources and connect applications, they run into barriers, particularly when it's not readily connected, like through an API. And then it's really expensive to have a team with the technical expertise to do that. So what we found was that, and what I found was I either had to pay consultants and external teams a lot of money to do that. I had to invest a lot of money to build internal teams to solve those problems. And I still ran into challenges like people love data lakes, but it's a great metaphor because if you're not constantly refreshing that data, the water turns stagnant. And then it's not very useful or very healthy for that business because you're making decisions on old data. And so one of the things that really has changed fundamentally in the last 9 months is the advent of some of the AI tools. And with the combination of my co-founders happens to just deep expertise in data science and engineering, but also in development and use of AI, is the ability to automate some of these connections, regardless of whether there's an API or not, regardless of whether data are internal or external. We can leave data where they are without the need or the expense to migrate it somewhere else. And we can access it even when there aren't open APIs to allow teams to be able to analyze it in real time, have it live, current, so that they can actually ask and answer questions that matter most to them in their business.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, I hadn't thought about, well, those of us who have been in the tech world, APIs and the lack thereof, we're familiar with the challenges, but the unique way that you're kind of coming about solving that without batch uploads and manual linkages that require big IT teams, that's really, really clever. What has been some of the organizational challenges around kind of implementing this solution and getting it right? Because it's kind of a nuanced way of thinking about getting access to your data and then being able to leverage that data.
Yeah, so I think it's oftentimes it's the same problem people run into with other technology, which is human beings and getting them to expand their mind to what's possible. And I think usually there are assumptions and grooved kind of neural patterns or behaviors about what is or isn't possible in terms of data access, and then old ways of doing things. And I think what we have really tried to do is we don't have religion one way or the other about how they want to organize their data, because we can really sit lightly on top of their tech stack and their data stack and help them without the need for these big migrations. So if somebody wants to invest in a data lake, we're happy to sit on top of that. And there may be other business purposes that have it or that call for that need, although we can help them avoid the massive investment and paying for data twice when they do it. But if it's important to them, we're happy to work with them on that, or we're happy to work with them to help collect and integrate and analyze the data in their native application, structured or unstructured. I think it's really refreshing. And once people realize the possibilities, they start to let go of some of the old assumptions about what they have to do with their data. Like, oh, I have to clean it, structure it, tag it. It's like, nope, you can leave it where it is. It can be unstructured. And sometimes that's really useful. And we can work with you and your teams to really focus on the questions themselves. And what we like to say is the data and the analytical tools we can keep in the background. So we take the how off the table for you, and you can just focus on the why. Like, why does this matter to me?
That's really cool. Thinking about AI a little bit, one of the things we're helping teams kind of figure out how to get the best out of AI. And, we've talked a lot about throwing AI on top of broken processes or ugly or inaccurate data is a recipe for disaster. But one of the things I have found that it's exposed is new opportunities to gain insight or knowledge or better decision making out of data. But then you start using these AI tools with some interesting prompts, and then suddenly you're realizing, oh, well, I can't ask it that because I haven't fed it the data, or it doesn't have access to what it needs to give me the right answer. So then there's a drive and a need and incentive to get the data right. And so that's just kind of, my experience. When you think about your solution here and bringing AI into the mix, what are some top, kind of synergistic opportunities or just opportunities for improvement that come to mind that we as leaders need to think about for our businesses?
Yeah, that's a phenomenal question because I think most people ready, fire, aim. And what you're asking them to do is ready, aim, fire, and think about how they're going to use a tool before they invest a lot of money and bringing it into their tech stack, which is critical because there's a lot of overspending right now and signing license agreements before they're ready. And I think you hit the nail on the head. First and foremost, there has to be a thoughtful data strategy. We can help with that. That's one of the reasons we designed Wombat, is that we can help expedite and lower the cost for that data strategy. But there has to be thought of what data do I really need to answer the questions or to feed into the model so that it can help me analyze it, because those tools are only as good as the data they can access. And if we're old, if it's incomplete, then it's really not that useful. You've got a very expensive Ferrari that's in the garage or just going to collect groceries, and we're not getting the highest and best use out of it. So that, you hit the nail on the head in terms of data strategy. And the second piece, I actually think, and I know you and I've kind of hit it off on this idea before, which is what your firm does at Revenue Innovations. And that is working with leadership teams to ask better questions and then make sure they ask thoughtful questions and think about how to transform that information. We talk about it at Wombat, transform information into wisdom, but it's great. Why does that data matter to me? What am I going to do with it? How does it help me translate something important into an actionable plan my team can use and go execute on, that I know is going to drive the strategic goals and objectives. But my field team just needs to think about one or two things and go execute and do it really well every day. And so I think those are the two things that are most important. It's like, if I think about having a really great tool and I got a great hammer, I got to know why I'm swinging it. I've got to have a good house plan and a design, and I better have good nails and things that I can use against it. So otherwise, it's just going to be useless. And so I think about those questions as kind of the building plans, and the good data is the nails. And like, I'm going to go, use something, and I have the raw materials to make, good use of it.
That's great. I noticed you used a particular word in there I want to go back to, and that is wisdom. A lot of times we'll talk about, turning data into insights or actionable insights. Why did you land on the word wisdom? And is there a deeper meaning behind that you guys have found just in practice?
Yeah. So I think that difference in terms of transformation of information, and you mentioned it earlier, we're drowning in information. We're drowning in dashboards. We're drowning in metrics and KPIs. I think the question that I always come back to, and what I learned from what I consider some of my mentors and best leaders, is continuing to ask the question of, why do I care? And how can I use this information to make some meaning or drive results with my teams? And to me, that's the difference between information and wisdom, is that transformation process and applying it into something useful, thoughtful, and meaningful for my teams, my business. There's also, for me, like the name of Wombat, something fun is that like wombats actually dig and they tunnel. And so when we think about digging and tunneling through organizations' data, that's what we're doing. We're helping them access it and integrate it, like the network of tunnels that wombats build. More than one wombat is actually called a wisdom. And it's the collective that really matters and builds that community. And it's similar to data. One data point may be interesting, but is oftentimes not useful. It's the collection of data points that actually helps us understand relationships, and relationships of key variables, key information sets, key people that drive results. And the analysis is really those patterns in the relationships. So, it's a little bit of a play on word. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really cool. I love that. That's so good. I love the history of that and the meaning behind it. I want to ask you a bit of a personal question, and that is, if I got your history right, you've shared the leadership seat across, different companies, and I think you've left a C-suite role to build this, right? And that's a significant bet. What was it just initially? I mean, are you just that fascinated about data, or is the problem that magnificent to need to be solved? I mean, what kind of spurred you to just kind of, okay, let's make the leap and let's go make this happen?
Yeah, both. I think this would be most recently the second company that I started with, integrative health centers being the first. And in both cases, there was a real passion for the problem itself. And then also what I believed was a really big opportunity and need in the community. So, yes, economic, but more than anything, I think where I get most excited is where my passion actually feels like it can be useful and helpful for people. And when I'm sitting in executive team meetings and having these conversations, and we're struggling with, I mean, some of the best and most expensive business intelligence solutions out there, and we have phenomenal tech teams and, a big private equity sponsor, and we're still having trouble accessing and analyzing data that we can transform, or the data are old because of how they're connected or not connected. It's just it's back to that consistent and persistent pattern that I've seen, and a big opportunity, and one that I just enjoy working with passionate teams and leaders who are trying to help their business. And if we have tools that can help enable them to do that, that's a really satisfying working relationship. If sort of leading with the question of how can I help, and if people find it useful, then just delighted to be a part of that.
That's great. Good answer. As we wrap up here, you know that we work a lot with go-to-market leaders. So marketing leaders, revenue leaders, customer success leaders, channel leaders. Any kind of wisdom you would leave with them, whether they look into Wombat or not, as they just kind of think about how data impacts their particular function and their business as they lead into the future over the next few years?
Yeah, I think the one piece, regardless of how they get there, is that kind of discipline and structure of just always asking the question, what are the vital signs of my business or of my team? What are the fewest variables that have the biggest impact and produce the clearest signal of success, health, and function in the team, and really trying to limit it to those, 3 to 5 core vital signs, and then making sure that those feed down into, and you can measure them to understand how to track and then manage and coach the teams well. It's a process, and usually it takes a while on the front end. And we have people, and I mean, I've gone through it too. I think I have a sense of it. And then when I continue to dig, like back to the Wombat, just digging and digging and digging and digging, it's usually a process and takes a while to actually come to that answer of, okay, these are the 3 or 4. But I think that discipline and the process of getting to those core signals and vital signs, rather than just having KPI proliferation or dashboard proliferation, which actually creates more confusion than clarity, that'd be the one suggestion that I have. And then obviously, once you have a good sense of that, you got to make sure that you have access to the data and that they remain current and live, and you can measure it consistently.
That's great. And as you're digging and digging, make sure you have a great flashlight and you're not just relying on your streetlight.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's well said. I mean, I think don't stop. Like if you dig and come to a point where your business, your team doesn't have the data it needs, it's probably out there and people can help you find it, and you can't access it, particularly in the last 12 months. What's possible now and today is vastly different than what was possible even 18 months ago.
Good stuff. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, so we have to wrap up. The title of our podcast, of course, is Some Goodness. So let's wrap up with some goodness outside of what we talked about today. So my final question for you is, what is something that's brought you a little goodness lately?
My first answer, and I always like to go with the first thing that hits my mind, because it's usually the most authentic, actually sunshine. And I say that because I've had to remember it. I am in front of a computer all day, or I'm traveling, or in, conference rooms. And I've had to remind myself, like 10 minutes outside has been a phenomenal lift to my mood and just helps me feel more settled. And yeah, I've just had to remember, get outside. Like, the fluorescent lights of offices, whether at home or in a building, sometimes can be draining. So getting outside has brought me a lot of goodness recently.
I totally agree with that one. So everybody out there, take a break after this, step outside, get some vitamin D, a dopamine hit, get some of that sunshine in your eyes. Well, thank you, Michael, for being part of the show today. Fascinating conversation, and really appreciate all your insights and wisdom.
Thank you. Glad to be here. Appreciate it.
Some Goodness is a creation of Revenue Innovations. Visit us at revenueinnovations.com. and subscribe to our newsletter.